You cannot
Not a
sit there
single
while our
woman would
people
confront
starve.
the
You
giant
must
Alpha
act
King,
now, my
until a
liege.
courageous Omega
Enough.
took a step.
I will not be
The
commanded
people
by you.
whispered stories of the giant Alpha King, Kalen, a man so powerful and imposing that no woman in the kingdom dared to confront him. His towering figure and icy demeanor were enough to make even the bravest warriors tremble in fear. But today, the atmosphere in the royal capital was different. The usual silence that followed Kalen's presence had been replaced by an unusual buzz of excitement. For the first time in years, a new event had been announced, a contest for Kalen's favor. But it was not a contest of love. No, the prize was far greater, the chance to win a place at the king's side as his chosen partner, a position of unimaginable power. The women who came to compete were all from noble families. They were beautiful, poised, and powerful in their own rights. Some had come from distant lands, seeking Kalen's favor to gain influence in the kingdom. Others had been raised since birth to believe that they were destined to stand beside the great Alpha King. And yet, as Kalen entered the grand arena, there was a noticeable stillness in the crowd. Every eye was fixed on him, but there was no longing in their gazes, only fear. He was a king, and his power radiated from him like a storm waiting to break. His gaze swept across the women in the arena, his face cold and unmoving. Among them, one woman stood apart. Saris was not of noble blood. She was an Omega, an orphan, raised in the village of the outcasts, far from the glittering halls of power. Her clothes were simple, but her posture was straight and proud. She was not here to compete for Kalen's favor. She had no illusions of grandeur. She had come to confront the myth, the legend, the man that had haunted the kingdom for so long. As the contest began, Kalen did not acknowledge any of the women who had stepped forward. They showed their strength, their grace, and their beauty, but all he did was watch with a detached expression, his mind clearly elsewhere. Saris, however, was different. She had been watching him long before the contest started, and now, as the others faltered in their attempts to capture his attention, she felt the undeniable pull to step forward. With a slow, deliberate movement, she made her way to the center of the arena. The crowd fell silent. Even the noblewomen seemed to hold their breath as Saris raised her chin to face Kalen. Her heart was racing, not with fear, but with something she couldn't quite define. Was it defiance, curiosity, or something more dangerous, something that might lead her into the very heart of the storm? Kalen's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment the air around them seemed to shift. His gaze was sharp, and though there was no smile, something flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. A challenge, an invitation. "You think you can stand against me?" Kalen's voice echoed through the arena. It was not a question, it was a statement. His voice carried the weight of kingship, of centuries of power that had shaped his every word. Saris did not flinch. She took a step closer, her voice steady. "I think you need to be shown that there is more to strength than size, Your Majesty." A murmur ran through the crowd. There had been rumors, of course. Everyone in Nerun had heard the tales of the giant Alpha King's curse, of his inability to love, of his inability to even feel anything other than the cold need for power. But here before him stood an Omega, a woman who had no reason to stand in his path and yet dared to do so. Kalen's lips curled into a small, cold smile. He admired her courage, even if it was misguided. "Very well, then. Let us see if you can prove it." The challenge was set. Saris was to face him in a test of strength, a contest that no woman had ever dared to undertake. The others watched in awe and disbelief, but Saris did not look back. She only focused on Kalen, sensing the energy radiating from him, like the calm before a storm. The arena was large, and the ground beneath their feet was solid and unforgiving. Kalen was a giant, his muscles like steel beneath his royal armor, while Saris was slight in comparison, her only weapon being the courage that had brought her here. Saris took her stance, though she knew her chances were slim. Kalen moved first, his steps shaking the ground beneath her as he closed the distance between them in mere seconds. His hand shot out, aiming to grab her by the wrist. Saris dodged, not fast enough to avoid the force of his grasp, but just enough to slip from his grip. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she remained focused. She could feel the weight of his power, and yet she pressed on, her every step a challenge against the king's expectations. "You have courage," Kalen said, his voice low and almost admiring. "But courage alone will not be enough." With that he lunged, using his immense strength to bring her to the ground. Saris felt the weight of him pressing down on her, but she refused to give in. Her fingers dug into the dirt and she twisted, finding her balance before springing upward again. "I don't need your approval," Saris said through gritted teeth, her body shaking with the effort. "I'm not here for that." Kalen's eyes flashed with something unreadable. For the first time, there was a flicker of emotion behind his cold exterior. He had never expected an Omega to challenge him like this, not with words, not with strength, and certainly not with the fire that burned in her eyes. The crowd was silent, watching the clash of their wills, and it was in that silence that Saris made her move. She reached out and grasped the hilt of a sword lying on the ground, a weapon that was meant for the contest but had been abandoned by the other women. In one swift motion, she raised the sword not to strike him, but to face him with equal resolve. "I'm not afraid of you, Kalen," she declared. "I'm not afraid of your power or your curse." Kalen's expression darkened. He stood tall, towering over her, but something had shifted. He saw it now. This woman was not afraid of him. And in that moment, something inside him stirred, something he had long since buried beneath the weight of his kingly duties. He stepped back, the tension between them palpable. The crowd waited with bated breath. Saris had not won the contest, not by the rules at least. But she had proven something much more important. She had proven that even the most powerful king could be challenged, and that no woman, not even one born of humble means, was beneath his notice. Kalen's voice, softer now, rang through the arena. "You think you have what it takes to stand by my side?" Saris did not answer. She only held his gaze, unflinching. But his next words sent a shiver down her spine. "Then prepare to regret it." The moonlight was dim as it filtered through the tall, black spires of the castle, casting long shadows over the stone floor. Inside the grand hall, Kalen sat upon his throne, his eyes cold and distant, staring out at nothing. The war that had long threatened the kingdom was drawing nearer, but tonight it was not the war that occupied his mind. It was the woman who had dared to stand before him. Saris, the Omega who had defied him in the arena. Her words, her courage, her refusal to back down, all of it had pierced through the layers of ice he had carefully built around himself over the years. But it wasn't just her courage that unsettled him. It was the way she had looked at him, as if she saw beyond the king, beyond the curse, and straight into the heart of the man he had long since abandoned. He had not expected her to challenge him, not in this way. No woman had ever stood before him so defiantly, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that her presence had done something he hadn't experienced in years. It had shaken him. The heavy wooden doors to the throne room creaked open, and Kalen didn't need to turn to know who had entered. He could feel her approach, the quiet determination in her steps. Saris was not like the others. She didn't walk with the grace of royalty or the poise of a noblewoman. She walked like someone who had known struggle, someone who had learned to survive, no matter the odds. "You wanted to see me, Your Majesty." Her voice was steady, though there was a hint of uncertainty hidden beneath the surface. Sarah stood a few paces away, her hands folded in front of her, as though bracing for the storm she knew was coming. Kalen didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her in silence. The faintest hint of moonlight caught the edges of her face, highlighting the resolve in her expression. Her clothes were simple, but there was something striking about the way she held herself, something that commanded attention, despite her humble origins. "You've made quite the impression," Kalen said at last, his deep voice breaking the silence. "No one dares to face me as you did." Saris didn't flinch. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not here to please you, Kalen. I'm here because I believe there's more to you than what everyone else sees. You're not just a king, you're a man." Kalen's brow furrowed. "You speak as though you know me." "I don't need to know you to see what you are," Saris replied. "I see the curse that weighs on you. I see the loneliness that you hide behind your power." For a long moment, Kalen said nothing. The weight of her words hung in the air between them, a challenge, a truth he had never wanted to face. His hand tightened on the armrest of the throne, his fingers curling into a fist. He had ruled for so long, holding everything at arm's length, protecting himself from the world and the people in it. But Saris, this Omega, had come too close. "You think you can understand me?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "You think you know what it's like to bear the weight of a crown, to carry the burden of a curse?" Saris didn't back down. "I know what it's like to carry the weight of survival," she said softly. "And I know what it's like to be cast aside, to be treated like you don't matter. You're not the only one who carries a burden." Kalen's gaze narrowed, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of curiosity perhaps, or even something darker. "And what do you want from me, Saris? Why are you here?" She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm here because I think you deserve more than this," she said, her voice quieter now, almost tender. "You don't have to be a prisoner of your curse. You don't have to carry this alone." For the first time, Kalen looked away, his jaw tightening. He had been alone for so long that the idea of allowing someone in, of trusting someone, was foreign to him. But Saris had seen through him, and it both frightened and intrigued him. "You think you can change me?" His voice was harsh now, but there was no anger in it, only the raw edge of uncertainty. "I think you can change yourself," Saris replied, her voice steady. "But only if you let go of the chains you've wrapped around your heart." There was silence between them, thick and heavy, as Kalen tried to process her words. He had spent years building walls, convincing himself that he was beyond redemption, beyond anyone's reach. But Saris had broken through those walls in ways he couldn't understand. "You're an Omega," Kalen said, his voice softening. "What do you know of power, of responsibility? What do you know of sacrifice?" "I know what it's like to fight for a place in this world," Saris said quietly. "I know what it's like to give everything and still come up empty. But I also know that we're not meant to carry these burdens alone. We're meant to share them." Kalen stood up from the throne, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, he loomed over her, the full force of his presence pressing down on her. But there was something different now in the way he looked at her. The coldness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something deeper, something more human. "What is it you want from me, Saris?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to be free," she said, her words soft but unwavering. "I want you to let go of the past, of the curse, of the weight you carry. I want you to choose what's best for you, not for the throne, not for the kingdom, just for you." Kalen's chest tightened. The idea of letting go of everything he had known, the power, the responsibility, the fear, was terrifying. But something about Saris's words, her unflinching belief in him, made him want to try. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, something he hadn't dared to feel for a long time. He took a step closer to her, his voice rough. "And if I can't let go of it all," Saris looked up at him, her eyes soft yet determined. "Then I'll help you," she said simply. "But you have to trust me, you have to trust yourself." Kalen's heart hammered in his chest, and for the briefest moment he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could find the freedom he had longed for. But that freedom came at a cost. The darkness inside him, the curse that had bound him for so long, was not something that could be easily undone. And as he stood before Saris, he knew that their journey together would not be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and dangers that neither of them could foresee. But in that moment, as their gazes locked, Kalen felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of connection, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. "I don't know if I can let go," Kalen said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Saris reached out, her hand gently resting on his arm. "We'll find out together." And as the moonlight poured through the windows, bathing them both in its pale glow, Kalen realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing this battle alone. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Kalen, the giant Alpha King, a man who had ruled with an iron fist for years, was now forced to reckon with a truth he had long ignored. He was not as invincible as he had believed. Saris, the Omega who had dared to challenge him, had stirred something inside him that neither power nor fear could suppress. In the days after their conversation, Saris stayed at the castle, no longer just an outsider but a quiet presence beside him. At first, Kalen tried to keep his distance, continuing with the duties of a king, focusing on the approaching war and his responsibilities. But Saris's gaze, her unwavering confidence, and the way she seemed to look at him without fear or reverence began to erode the walls he had carefully built around himself. It wasn't just her courage that unsettled him, it was her kindness, the way she seemed to care for others without expecting anything in return. Her presence was like a warm fire, burning away the coldness that had gripped him for so long. And yet Kalen couldn't allow himself to believe that she was the answer to his loneliness, the one who could save him. That was a dangerous thought, one that could cost him everything. But even as he tried to push her away, fate had a different plan. Sarah stood by the large window of Kalen's private study, her fingers gently tracing the cold glass. Outside, the kingdom was quiet, the once vibrant streets now eerily empty in preparation for the war. The scent of rain lingered in the air, and the clouds above hung heavy with the promise of a storm. It had been nearly a week since Kalen had agreed to listen to her, to hear her words. The king had not spoken much since that night in the throne room, and their interactions had been minimal. He continued with his duties, but there was a distance between them, one that neither of them could bridge just yet. "Are you going to stand by that window all day?" Kalen's voice, rough and low, broke the silence. Saris turned, surprised to find him standing in the doorway, his dark eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. He was still the king, the alpha who ruled with power, but there was something different in him now, something she couldn't quite place. "I was just thinking," she replied, walking toward him, "about the storm that's coming, not just the one outside." Her eyes met his. "But the one you've been running from." Kalen's jaw clenched at her words, but he didn't look away. "I don't need you to remind me of my duty," he said, his voice tinged with the usual authority. But there was a hesitation there, a crack in his armor. "I'm not reminding you of anything," Sarah said quietly. "I'm only asking you to face it, face what's been holding you back." Kalen's eyes flickered, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold mask he wore so effortlessly. "I don't have time for this," he said, turning away to pace across the room. "The kingdom is on the brink of war and I need to prepare. I can't afford distractions." Saris crossed the room in 2 swift steps, blocking his path. She didn't back down. "What if I told you that this war isn't just about the kingdom? What if it's about you?" she asked, her voice unwavering. "What if you've been fighting the wrong battle all along?" Kalen froze, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He said nothing for a long moment, and Saris could see the conflict within him. He was fighting a battle between the man he had become and the man he could still be. "Let me help you," she whispered, stepping closer. "Let me help you fight what's inside, not just the war outside." Kalen looked at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, or even hope, that flashed in his eyes. "Why?" His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Saris didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and gently placed her hand on his chest, over the cold armor he wore. "Because I believe in you," she said simply. "I believe that the man behind this mask is worth saving." For a moment the world seemed to stand still. Kalen's breath caught in his throat, and the weight of her words settled deep within him. He had never known anyone who had spoken to him like that, not as a king, not as a ruler, but as a person. And for the first time, Kalen realized that Saris wasn't just a woman who had come into his life. She was a force, one that could either tear him apart or heal him, but Kalen was not someone who gave in easily. His heart had been hardened by years of isolation, and the idea of letting someone in, someone like Saris, was a terrifying thought. Yet standing before her, he felt the pull. Her touch, her gaze, her unwavering belief in him, it all stirred something deep inside him. He wanted to pull away, to retreat back into the safety of his cold, solitary world. But Saris was not going to let him go that easily. "You don't have to be afraid of me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm not asking you to give up your kingdom. I'm asking you to give up the fear that's been controlling you, the fear of failure, the fear of not being enough." Kalen closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. He was not used to this. He was used to being feared, respected, and obeyed. But Saris saw him in a way no one else ever had. She didn't look at him like a king. She looked at him like a man, flawed, broken, and in need of something more. When Kalen opened his eyes, there was something different about him. The coldness that had defined him for so long was still there, but now it was tempered with something else, something warmer. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "I don't know if I can change. I've been this way for too long." Sarah stepped closer, her hand still resting against his chest. "You don't have to change overnight, Kalen. You just have to start, one step at a time." Kalen's heart pounded in his chest, and he felt an ache deep inside him, an ache he hadn't known was there until now. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of something beyond the curse, beyond the throne. But that hope came with a price. He would have to face his darkest fears, and the journey would be long and painful. But as he stood there with Saris's hand over his heart, he realized something. Maybe he didn't have to face it alone. For the first time, Kalen allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't just the king, the ruler, the curse-bearer. Maybe he could be something more. Maybe he could be free. "I'm not sure I can do this," Kalen admitted, his voice low, almost a whisper. Sarah smiled, her touch warm and steady. "We'll figure it out together." And in that moment, as the storm outside began to rage, Kalen made a decision. He wasn't going to face this battle alone. He wasn't going to let fear control him anymore. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to break the chains that had held him captive for so long. As Sarah stood beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the storm, Kalen felt something shift deep inside. The fire and ice within him had finally begun to meld, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to hope. The kingdom of Nerun stood on the brink of disaster. The war that had loomed for years was now at its gates, and the time for talk had passed. The rival pack, led by a ruthless alpha king named Zephyros, was marching toward the capital, determined to claim Kalen's throne for his own. But as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, something else had shifted within Kalen. His once impenetrable walls of isolation had crumbled, piece by piece, under the weight of Saris's words, her touch, and the quiet strength she had shown him. She had become his anchor in a world that had been nothing but cold winds and battles for as long as he could remember. And now, as he stood at the edge of the war that could destroy everything he had fought for, he felt a new fire inside him, a fire he had not known existed. Sarah stood beside him on the balcony of the castle, the wind sweeping through her hair. The scent of rain was heavy in the air, mixing with the earthy fragrance of the forest below. The land was still and waiting as though holding its breath. "You've changed," Kalen said quietly, his voice low but firm. His gaze was distant, staring out at the horizon as if trying to see the future that was coming toward him. Saris turned to him, her heart beating faster at the weight of his words. "Have I?" she asked, her voice steady. She knew what he meant. She had seen the change in him too, the way his once cold eyes had softened when he looked at her, the way his decisions had become more thoughtful, more selfless. But it wasn't just him who had changed. She had too. She was no longer just an outsider looking in. She was part of something bigger now. Kalen looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a woman to be feared or a subject to rule. He saw a person who had come into his life and torn down the walls he had spent so long building. He saw someone who believed in him, even when he hadn't believed in himself. "I've never known anyone like you, Saris," Kalen admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "You make me question everything I thought I knew about myself." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes soft but full of strength. "I didn't come here to change you, Kalen," she said gently. "I came here to help you see the truth, that you're not alone, you never have been." Kalen's heart tightened at her words. He had always felt alone, even in the midst of his power. But now, with Saris beside him, he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he was. Maybe they could face this war together, not as king and subject, but as two people who had found something real in each other. But the world outside was not waiting for their emotions to settle. The rival pack was drawing nearer, and Kalen knew that the time for words was over. The time for action had come. The war begins. The army of Nerun gathered at the edge of the capital, the soldiers standing at attention in their shining armor. The land was tense, the air thick with anticipation. The castle's walls were lined with archers, ready for whatever Zephyros and his army would bring. Sarah stood at Kalen's side as he surveyed the battlefield. He could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. He was not just fighting for the kingdom anymore, not just for his throne. He was fighting for something more important, the chance to live a life beyond the curse that had held him captive for so long. "Are you ready?" Saris asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. Kalen turned to her, his gaze steady. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for this, but I will fight, for you, for us." Saris's heart swelled at his words. She had never expected to hear him say such things. And yet here they were, standing together, ready to face whatever came next. She knew the road ahead would be filled with danger, with loss, and perhaps even death. But she also knew that they had each other now, and that was worth fighting for. "We'll make it through this," Saris said, her voice full of conviction. "Together." Kalen nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He had never been one for hope, for dreams of a life beyond the throne. But now, with Saris by his side, he could see a different future, one where he was no longer bound by the chains of his past. The first horn sounded, a deep, booming sound that sent a shiver through the air. The battle had begun. The battle. The battlefield was chaos. The sounds of swords clashing, shields breaking, and men shouting filled the air. Kalen fought at the front of his army, his strength unmatched, cutting down foes with a precision and power that left his enemies in awe and fear. His soldiers followed him with unwavering loyalty, knowing that with Kalen leading them, they had a chance to win. But in the midst of the battle, Kalen felt something shift. The curse that had always lurked inside him, the one that had filled him with rage, with darkness, began to stir. The power he had relied on for so long was tempting him, calling to him, offering him the strength to crush his enemies with a single thought. It was easy to give in, to let the darkness take over and become the beast he had always feared. But then he saw her. Saris, fighting with her own courage, her own strength, cutting down foes with a fierceness that reminded him of why he was fighting. She was not just by his side, she was with him in every sense of the word. And that thought, that bond, pulled him back from the edge. He couldn't lose himself now, not when she was here, not when they had something worth fighting for. Kalen fought with renewed vigor, his every strike more powerful than the last. He could feel the darkness inside him, but he chose to fight it. He chose to fight for the light, Saris, their future, the life they could have together. The battle raged on for hours, the sky darkening as night fell. The soldiers of Nerun began to push back Zephyros's army, their resolve strengthened by Kaelin's leadership and Cerys's unyielding presence. And then, finally, the rival pack's forces began to retreat. The tide had turned and victory was within reach. Kaelin, bloodied and bruised but unbroken, looked out over the battlefield. His soldiers were cheering, the victory theirs, but there was one more challenge to face: the final confrontation. Zephyros, the alpha king of the rival pack, stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes locked onto Kaelin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that burned with ambition. His pack had nearly crushed Nerun's army, but now, with his forces in retreat, he knew there was only one thing left to do: destroy Kaelin. Kaelin walked toward him, his steps slow but deliberate. Cerys followed closely behind, her hand resting on his arm, a steadying presence in the midst of the chaos. Zephyros sneered as Kaelin approached. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat. "You'll never be rid of the curse that binds you. You'll always be a beast." Kaelin's gaze hardened. "Maybe, but I am no longer ruled by that curse. Not anymore." The two alphas clashed, the sounds of their battle echoing through the night. Kaelin's strength was unmatched, but Zephyros fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. Finally, with a swift movement, Kaelin disarmed Zephyros, sending the rival alpha sprawling to the ground. He stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart racing with the adrenaline of battle. "This kingdom is mine," Kaelin said, his voice low and steady. "And I will protect it, whatever it takes." Cerys stepped forward, standing beside him. Together, they looked down at the defeated alpha, and in that moment, Kaelin realized that he was no longer the same man who had stood alone, a prisoner of his curse. He was free not just of the curse but of the fear that had held him captive for so long. He turned to Cerys, his gaze softening. "We've done it," he said, his voice filled with awe. Cerys smiled, her hand finding his. "No, we've done it together." And as the storm finally passed, leaving a quiet calm in its wake, Kaelin knew that the battle was not just for the throne, it was for his future, for the life he could now build with Cerys by his side.